Hi, everybody, and welcome to First Impressions panel. My name is Jen Jumba. I am a librarian here at the Cleveland Public Library main campus, and I manage the popular department. And I'm so excited to be moderating this panel. I love reading debut writers, and then having the opportunity to talk to these talented storytellers is even better. And all I will say is if this is their debut, we have so much to look forward to. So please join me in welcoming T. Kiara Mahalani Madden with Mariner Books and HarperCollins. David Marsalam, The Outer Country, One World, Penguin Random House Books. Say Sawatika. Heather Amy O'Neill, The Irish Goodbye, Henry Holt and Company from Macmillan. Patmina Sabit, Good People, Crown, Penguin Random House. And Jan Signs, 200 Mona's Little Brown and Company from Hachette. So excited to be joining you all this afternoon to be talking to you about your debut novel. So first of all, congratulations. This day, I'm sure felt like it would never get here. All the edits, all the drafts, everything else, but so excited. These books are all phenomenal. I enjoyed reading them. The little snippets of language that you all used, I have written down and tucked in my pocket. So on a tough day, I can just pull out and be reinvigorated all over again. So I think we'll just kind of start, and I'll just call on each one of you so that we're not talking over each other because we're super excited. But we'll start with T. Kiara. How would you introduce your book to someone who is picking it up for the first time?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's an honor to be on this panel with these amazing writers. Whidbey is, my debut novel. I would introduce this as a work of literary fiction with a little thriller edge that is about the fantasy of revenge and also the other side of that revenge fantasy, the razor's edge of how that might backfire. It's a story of three women connected through one man in the days after his murder. It's a story about the carceral system of America, our cultural obsession with punishment. And I hope it asks some really crucial, both cultural, political, and personal questions about how how we reconcile these feelings about revenge and anger and female rage.
I can say that. I think for each one of your books, I know I use the word haunted in a good way, thinking about the books and continuing to think about the stories. And you always want to think, well, what would I do, or what would my family do? And each one of your books strikes this chord to the essence of who we are as human beings. So absolutely, it asks incredible questions, and not easy questions, I will add. How about you, David?
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you so much for letting me be part of this. I'm really excited. And my book, The Outer Country, follows a family who immigrates to Los Angeles from Thailand in the late 1970s after the Vietnam War. And the household is a little unusual because there are two maternal figures, and they're sort of rival sisters. So Manda is the older, sort of headstrong, strategic sister, and then Sirapan is more of the people pleaser, the one who's willing to do all the chores and keep the house going. And they're both taking care of this boy named Ben, who is Sirapan's son. As Ben is growing up, he admits to wanting to be a girl, and Manda doesn't want him to be that way. So she secretly arranges for this monk to come and sort of exorcise the female spirit from his body. But the ceremony backfires, and Ben ends up being really ill. So we follow the events leading up to this ceremony, and we follow the aftermath where Manda is waiting for this conversion therapy to complete. And Sirapan is trying to figure out why her son suddenly has this mysterious illness. So it's a story about immigration. It's a story about growing up gay, and it's definitely a story about secrets.
Absolutely. I think secrets weave throughout each one of these stories, and how long they can be kept secret, and the toll that that takes, I think, on individuals when they are asked to keep things secret. Pet Mina, how about you?
Hi everyone, I am so thrilled to be here and to be meeting all of you. Thank you, Taylor. My book, Good People, is about the Sharaf family. It's an Afghan family who come to the United States as refugees. They flee the fighting in Afghanistan. And it's about their faith in the American dream and their dogged pursuit of that dream and the achievement of it. And then the slow unraveling and ultimate destruction of that dream after the death of their teenage daughter, Zora, when questions arise as to whether or not her death was truly an accident. And I think that the book is mainly about the Afghan experience of displacement and exile, but it also speaks very much to questions of family and identity, loss, grief, and xenophobia, and who we believe we are and what others think of us as well.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I don't know who picked these books to be talked about, but it's amazing how different the stories are, but yet such common themes throughout in terms of family and identity and culture, and how we act and how we think we should act based on what other people think, which I think is something that is incredibly relatable. So these stories are certainly going to resonate once more people read them when they debut. Jan, how about you? How would you describe 200 Monas?
Hi. Wow. So introducing 200 Monas, I might as well just introduce you to Arvi, like we're at a dinner party or something. Arvi is 22. She's very, very funny. And when we meet her, she has just lost her mom. She's cleaning out her mother's closet. And she finds a bag of pills. And unfortunately, it's finals week, and she's got a lot on her plate. But we come to find out that the pills do something very special. They make you orgasm. They induce orgasm. And unfortunately for RV, some drug dealers come a knocking, and they basically give her an ultimatum. They say, "I'll give you 48 hours to sell these, and or else." So she recruits this drug dealer to help her kind of on this quest to sell these drugs. Of course, he's hot. Of course, there's a romance in this like wacky ride. Um, and I always say it's a book about orgasms, but really it's a book about grief and how you sort of see RV, who is denying herself this sort of permission to feel her grief completely and honestly, and how in through this kind of wacky ride of distractions and meeting people, we see someone really bloom and open up and allow themselves to sort of begin the grieving process and sort of crack something open.
Absolutely. She's a great character, who, I guess finds some of the humor amidst that loss and amidst the grief of losing her mom. Heather, how would you introduce this book to somebody just picking it up for the first time?
All these books sound so wonderful. Thank you for having me. I would describe The Irish Goodbye as a story of three sisters, the Ryan sisters, who come from an Irish Catholic family. They're returning home for Thanksgiving weekend on the North Fork of Long Island, and when their oldest sister invites an unexpected guest from their past, they are forced to confront and really reckon with a tragedy that has haunted them all for years. But similarly, I mean, I describe it as a book about grief, but I think it's also a book about really how forgiveness and empathy can guide us towards healing.
Well, without a doubt. I wish more people would take that advice. Just saying. So talk a little bit about structure of your books. Many of you use multiple points of view, which for me as a reader, I just think creates a richer and more nuanced version of the story. Can you talk about a little bit about the structure, why you chose to do that versus a single point of view? And we'll start this time with Padmina.
Yeah, so for me, I think the structure of using multiple points of view was essential for two things. First, because we never hear directly from the Sharaf family or the immediate family. The multiple points of view were necessary to create and portray these main characters. And not just portray them, but to do that with all their human complexity. And I think that using so many and varied points of view allowed me to do that with a lot more depth than I think a single or even 2 or 3 points of view could have. And the second thing was, it was important for me, or one of the things I wanted to explore were the preconceptions and biases that we all have and hold and that we apply to trying to understand one another. And because the story of the Sharaf family is refracted through the eyes of so many different people, we see their biases and their beliefs color their telling of those events. So for me, I think principally it was those two things where I felt that the multiple points of view just worked really well.
Absolutely, it did. From investigative reporters to neighbors to family friends, teachers. I think the thing that got me with this book is that we never heard from the main characters. I think that's so unique. I mean, typically we read multiple points of view and we understand everybody, but their point of view, that the absence of that just furthered the story in terms of the complexities that we bring based on our own life experience and how we view somebody else's. So I think I mentioned that I've been thinking about this book, all of these books nonstop, these big questions that are asked. So very well done. David, how about you?
Yeah, I actually originally wrote this book from the aunt's point of view, Aunt Manda. She was the one who was the most interesting to me, and I wanted to figure out why she would, go through this. Why would she force her nephew to endure this ceremony? And as I was writing, I had a mentor who, one semester during my MFA program, just said, explore, experiment, and try different things. So I started writing from the sister's point of view, who is Ben's mother. And my mentor said, this is great. It really is completing the story. Just keep going. And, a year later, I added Ben's point of view. And finally, after I was working with One World, my wonderful editor, Oma, said, well, you've done these three. You have to talk about the dad. You have to write from the dad's point of view as well. And I really resisted that. But I eventually did it. And it was interesting because I would have readers tell me, okay, well, he's not going to be a villain as soon as you tell the story from his point of view. He becomes very sympathetic. And I really like that idea of understanding all the characters as people rather than as, villains and heroes. So for me, it really opened up all the characters and just made them complete, made them real people.
So well done. And I appreciate the fact that nobody was vilified initially, that you come to understand not just what somebody did, but why they did it. And then hopefully that's where that whole we as readers develop empathy comes from, because we're seeing different perspectives, different points of view, and understanding why somebody did what they did. Heather, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I love books with different points of view. I'm so interested in how people and characters can experience the same event and walk away with very different versions, and how, as a reader, you can see that the truth exists really somewhere in between. So I wanted to explore that with the sisters and kind of that dance between perception and reality. And I really love writing different points of view, because when I find anyway, especially within a family dynamic, when one character feels closed off to me, I can sometimes get in through another character. And particularly with sisters, I have sisters, and I think that, we, in some ways, we see each other very authentically because we know where we came from, and in other ways we're very blind and we don't see each other, accurately because we're stuck in this kind of past. So I wanted to explore that with the sisters, and I actually I also had an additional point of view originally when I started, which was the mother's perspective, and eventually took her out and really centered more on the siblings. Um, so that was kind of my decision around that.
I think it's so interesting what you just said about, growing up together, you sisters you have, growing up authentically, knowing where you came from, and then at the same time still being trapped in the past. I think we all experience this. We go home for some sort of holiday or some sort of celebration, and you go right back to the role that you were when you were 18, not like all the experience I've had since then.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how we kind of go back into a role around family, or when certain things happen, we just, I don't know, say regress, but that's
No,
really
we
not
do.
what's best. Yeah, exactly. Not always for the best, but
Right.
but I always find it really interesting because there's always that tension that exists within that individual. Like, that's not who I am anymore. Like, why do they still see me like this? And
And then when you have other people coming into the dynamic and being like, why are you acting that way? Or, like,
exactly
have
right.
this different perspective.
Absolutely. Tikira, how about you?
Sure. So, Whidbey is absolutely a work of fiction, but the initial impulse to write the book comes from my real life lived experience. This is my debut novel, but I wrote a memoir first, and part of that memoir covers being a survivor of child sex abuse, and that person then continuing to stalk me throughout my life until it ended up going to federal trial in 2019. So fiction for me, the thrill and joy of fiction is that I get to take these questions that feel totally unanswerable and messy, and I get to kind of spin them like tops and see, like, here are all the questions I still have. Here are all the things that have not been answered in my life or in my memoir. I wasn't interested in writing about my experience anymore after having written that memoir, but I still had so many burning, lingering questions after that trial. Um, for example, like, what does it take for a parent to continue showing up for a child who has done monstrous things, with evidence before them, to still sit in denial, which was the case in my trial. So one of the narrators of Whidbey is the mother of the abuser, and the other was this really kind of gnawing question I have, which is, why are certain victims of violent crimes and sex abuse considered credible witnesses or survivors, while others are simply victims, and considered uncredible, are not able to have a voice in something like the trial system? Because I am a college professor, because I'm able to write my own victim impact statement, because I was an author, I was considered a credible witness. But I also saw how this hierarchy was created of who should be believed and who should not be believed. And as an educator, I also work with incarcerated people, and I do believe in, revision to the carceral system. And so I stood there on trial having these really conflicting beliefs of, yes, I'm standing here as a survivor, as a victim, but also the system is broken, and here are the reasons why. And I kept being told, you have to choose a side, you have to make this tidier. And that's not something I could do, but it's something that I could do in this novel by choosing someone who's considered credible, who the system believes all the way through, by choosing an Asian American whose case is dismissed from the same crime, the same perpetrator, and by choosing the mother who's been disenfranchised by the system. That was my way of kind of holding all of those simultaneous truths and kind of digging into them. To me, they're all heroes and they're all villains. And the third part of my book, it's told in three parts. It shifts from first person to third person to an omniscience in the third part. And that is the part that kind of implicates the reader and asks, in a direct address, like, why is it that you believed these stories over other stories in the previous two sections? So to me, the book is, it's marketed as a whodunit, but to me, it's mostly about storytelling itself and why we believe certain stories over others.
Yeah, these are amazing big questions that you're grappling with, and the experience that you had. I'm hoping that this gave you some sort of resolution, because now you're posing the questions in a book. And I think when we read books and have discussions, it, it's easier to talk about those tough questions because we're talking about a character in a book and not that person sitting directly across from us. So I believe that the questions asked in all of these books, which are great questions about culture and identity and family and loss, will also encourage other people to have these tough discussions so that we can see reform and acceptance and respect moving forward. Jan, your book is told from a single perspective. Can you talk about why RV, who's such a great character, why you chose to tell it from her perspective and not use multiple points of view?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, I would assume every other writer on this panel feels the same way. Trying to figure out point of view and really having that debate with yourself at the beginning of a project is a strange kind of torture. And you're always workshopping like, well, what works and what doesn't or what makes sense. And I feel like with 200 Monas, there was never a question in my mind that it was going to be first person and that it was going to be more of this sort of performance based voice and journey, just through this one singular character. And I think the reason why it never seemed like a question was because RV is sort of alone in this world when we meet her, because she is internalizing so much and there is a wall up. And it almost seems like she's in the sort of stage of grief where she is in sort of a denial. There is sort of an anger there, and she doesn't really know how to feel, or how to sort of open up. There's no guidebook on how to grieve. And so when you're young, especially, and you lose a parent, there is a lot of like, I don't know how to do this or what to be. Not that anyone does, but I think when you're even younger and you don't have a lot of access to your emotions, you haven't lived enough life to really know how to process emotions. I think that's where RV's at right now. And as someone who has lost a parent when I was younger, I could absolutely relate to that and slip into those shoes so easily. Um, but yeah, for me, it had something to do with this idea that she had a wall up, and you just want to get sort of behind that. You want to put a reader right there in her shoes behind that wall, so that they are sort of understanding how she is sort of processing this really difficult thing. It's also, I mean, the book is kind of this roller coaster ride. It's very, very close. It's in present tense. And there is something to be said about that too. Like, how are you really, really positioning a reader in a way that feels very, very close, and they almost can't to get out of it. There's like a sort of anxiety of like, I am in this girl's shoes, whether I want to be or not. And I've just got to sort of process everything the way that she's sort of processing it. And like I said, I think that creates very interesting, enjoyable and entertaining anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah, I was certainly anxious reading it, and all your books. I mean, I think that's the gift that you all as storytellers give us as readers, is the ability to be inside of a character or feel as if we were right there in that room when things happen, or right there in the scene, just kind of observing, which is a spectacular gift. Because the way I look at it is, we all have access to roughly the same amount of words, right? I mean, we might know a few different things, but you all as storytellers are able to put those words together in a way that creates a character that, we're cheering for, we don't like, and then we do like, a setting where like our heart starts to race when there's the knock on the door. So it is to me, it is truly a gift, to be able to do that. So whatever your process is, I say please continue, for us as readers, because it's amazing what you all have done, and I marvel at it every single day. So thinking about your stories, besides being absolutely fabulous, are different settings, different plots, different characters, but there's a lot of themes that they have in common. There's stories about loss, there's stories about childhood and how childhood is impacted by loss. There's stories about family. The overall sense I picked up is this wanting to belong. I think, we're human beings. We're wired for connection, and wanting a place where we don't have to play that role, and we can just authentically, be ourselves. I think about the secrets that we all keep. So, will you talk a little bit about your main characters and how their roles change when they're with their family? And this time we'll start with Heather.
Yeah, and as we were talking about earlier, the way that I think we all sort of regress when we go home. That certainly happens with these sisters. And I was really interested in that struggle between kind of what they inherited and what they're trying to become. They've lost a brother to suicide, and that has, about a decade or so before the book starts, and that all affects them very differently. And so when they returned for this Thanksgiving holiday, it's, you were talking before about setting. Setting was an important um, kind of character for me as well in the story. Their house is called the Folly, and it's this kind of big, beautiful, crumbling Victorian on the water. And that serves as a metaphor in its own way, because, there's this kind of rootedness that the house represents. But also all of the sisters are kind of returning from their very independent adult lives. And once they get back into this space, they're kind of limited in a lot of ways by how the family sees them from the past as opposed to really who they are now. And yet they can show up in that way as well through their regression. So um, for me, that kind of question of identity, like who they are together versus who they're trying to become on their own, was important. And I think in many ways they were trying to come into their own by separating from the past. And what the journey of the weekend shows them is that they need to also be there to support one another and confront the past in order to like really fully come into their own selves.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I think each character, each of those three sisters, kind of comes into their own, and you can see these increments of growth, during that Thanksgiving holiday weekend.
Yeah,
Sure.
growth is hard, and we don't usually,
It is very.
we don't usually want to do it. We want to
No.
stay in our kind of little spaces, but yeah, sometimes life forces it.
Absolutely. T. Kira, how about you?
Yeah, thank you for these beautiful, thoughtful questions. I don't think any of my three main characters really know who they are at all. I think they are defined by their suffering in many ways. I think that's largely what the book is about. And I think we see through the course of the story, in the days again after this abuser's death, how they're kind of trying to wrestle with that. Like, who am I outside of my suffering? Once my suffering cannot be commodified, in the case of one character who she was on reality TV. The producers kind of shaped her story that she would be this survivor and reveal this truth on a dating show. And then she gets a big book deal for a tell-all memoir. And so her value, even more so, is just emphasized by her suffering. But the moving vehicle in the book, I think, of these paths these characters have taken kind of crashes against the wall when this person dies, and they no longer understand who am I without my fear, without my suffering, without the story that has been shaped and created for me, and without these kind of funhouse mirrors of the people that have surrounded me through my suffering for so long. In the case of Mary Beth Boyer, it's her son's death. Her entire life has been about defending her son. Her entire life has been emptied and disenfranchised by these systems in honor of defending her son. And for these two survivors, once that kind of disappears, they're forced to kind of face themselves, which I think is the true horror of the book.
Absolutely. I mean, so many times I think it's relatable that we see and we, by things that happen to us, that becomes our identity, or by what we do for a living, that becomes our identity. And without that, who are you? And those are big questions. I mean, it's hard enough to grapple with who you are anyway, let alone adding, something, tragic, and loss in terms of navigating that process. So well done. Um, David, how about you and your characters?
Yeah. So I think there's a component of every member who sort of holds a lot back when they're with their family. They want to make sure that they preserve the secrets because they're so worried that if everything comes out, the family will sort of disintegrate. As I was working on the book, I came to sort of identify this other tension, and this is the balance between like love and survival. And I think what's interesting to me is the idea that you can be part of a family and you can love everyone in it, but there's also a component of self-preservation. And I think in my book, Ben, the boy, goes from being a young person who was just struggling to survive to learning how to love his family members. And Manda, the aunt, sort of goes in the opposite direction. She starts out loving everyone, and then by the end, she's just struggling to survive and trying to figure out what can she do to make it to the end of her life without suffering.
Very, very well said. And again, a topic that I think that will resonate with a lot of people, and speaks similar to what Tikira was saying about her characters and, who they are with this tragedy and with the suffering, and same thing with the characters in your book and following their story arc. Jan, how about you and RV and Wolf?
Yeah, my book really is primarily about relationships with mothers, and in particularly Arvi and Wolf, who is the romantic lead. They both come from single mother homes. They are the only child in that dynamic, and they both feel very tethered to their mother in some way. And I love what David said about um holding a lot back when you are sort of in the presence of a family member or something like that, because I do think that RV sees herself as a caregiver when her mother was alive, but even after death, RV is sort of still taking on this sort of caregiving role. I think she's always putting her mother in front of who she is. She's always sort of electing her mother's life and her mother's advice over her own life and her own advice, even after her mother has passed away. And again, just sort of like holding back who she is because she's prioritizing who her mother is, or her mother's health, I guess you would say. But I think this question is really more fascinating to answer about Wolf's character. You find out in the book that Wolf's mother is this very like powerful, influential feminist leader of this like underground sorority. And like I won't give too much away, but yeah, you basically find out that Wolf was raised his whole life by this very strong feminist mother who really instilled a lot of history and an understanding of the female, and and the feminist lifestyle into him. And he's always been raised around women. And so it's interesting when you see him around his mother and around Seder, there's a part of him that sort of holds himself back, and he almost slips into a more submissive role, and he almost seems a little more diminished. And that's not the Wolf that you meet in the beginning of the novel. You meet this kind of really sexy, resourceful, very confident guy. And then when he's around his mother, he just completely changes. And he says something in the book like, I was never, he has an awareness that he's like this. And he said, when I was younger, I was never mad about it, just a little sad maybe. And I relate to that so much, and the idea that like you kind of hold yourself back to make someone else comfortable. And sometimes you kind of get stuck in that habit. But yeah, that's it. I think for me, it's more about not necessarily how they change when they're with their family, but more just about the tether that binds them from keeping from just completely being themselves or being free from the hold that their mother has on them in some way.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to the fact too that they're also very young. So, I mean, that when you're, 21, 22, I mean, your parents have a tremendous influence on you. And as you get older, that tether, I don't know that it ever breaks, but I think it just gets longer. Um, I know my parents said that they raised my sister and I with roots and wings, roots so that we always have a place to come home to, and wings so that we can fly on our own. But then I think about all the characters in these other stories and think like a lot of it's the same thing. It's just how can you actually make that tether longer, and not so influenced and starting to live your own life for you, not the people pleaser role, which so many people find themselves in. Pat Mina, talk a little bit about, your characters.
Yeah, I think when I think of Zora, the sheriff's teenage daughter, I think she has such a strong sense of who she is and what she wants to become in the world. She's an artistic, creative, free-spirited young woman who wants to travel the world. She wants to live in Paris and New York. She wants to be a makeup artist and doesn't really at heart care about school or academic achievement. But with her family, that part of her is very much hidden. I would say almost completely hidden. With her family, she is the overachieving, hardworking student and the dutiful Afghan daughter. And with her family, she is the young woman who is striving to meet these cultural expectations that her family have, and the expectations of academic success and eventual professional success. And so I would say that she not just plays that role, but plays it so well that some of her later actions come as a complete shock to her family, and catch them completely off guard. So definitely a character who is a completely different person outside of her family than she is inside.
Yeah, absolutely. And that tension that exists between who her parents expect her to be and what her father expects her to grow up and where to go to school and what to study. And she completely wants the opposite. Um, so, I think stories are this special art form, right? And this point of connection for us as human beings. And so struck by the characters in your books and how you were able to capture their loneliness and wanting to belong, um, which often stems from being caught between two worlds. So I'm going to read a line from each of your books and just ask you to comment, if that's okay. We'll start with Heather. And she uses a quote that Isabel and Maggie are having an argument. Maggie is one of the Ryan sisters, that we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
Yeah, that's actually a conversation between Maggie and her mother, Nora.
Oh,
Um, but it's about Isabel. Maggie has brought her girlfriend Isabel home, and her mother, Nora, who's deeply Catholic, is not very receptive to this. And um, that theme for me was so important. This idea of how, kind of what we talked about earlier with point of view, how we see, even see our families, how our family sees us, how that defines us, how we kind of fall into these roles. And when Maggie says that to her mother, she's really in many ways like begging to be seen. And but through the journey of the story, the process also becomes about Maggie learning to see her mother, kind of so similar to what Davin was saying about, not having someone just be a villain, but trying to understand kind of where they come from, even if they have a different perspective, and honestly, if their perspective can cause a lot of pain, to you as the person receiving it. But I think, when you're talking about that tension between belonging and becoming, that can create a lot of loneliness. But I do think that's where empathy begins. and it's starting to for Maggie, who's the youngest child. And I can say, as the youngest child, we can sometimes be a bit self-focused in our family dynamic because we're used to, everyone else taking care of us, and Maggie has to kind of wake up to that a little bit, and that's part of her coming of age, and not just expecting to be received and seen, but to do that for her mother as well.
Yeah, I think that all of us as readers, I mean, everybody's going to go out and read your books, and it's the same story, but how it hits and resonates with each one of us as readers differently, I think is what makes it special, and what makes discussing or talking about books even more special is because you just learn even more different perspectives. Let's talk, David. You talk about inside outside in your story, particularly Ben. Um, Ben says, ridding his body of the heaviness that made him feel so trapped all the time. He threw up to feel better. He threw up to survive. And in the bathroom, he was alone and unjudged.
Yeah, so I think the more obvious division of someone who's growing up between two cultures is just this idea of Ben having to understand how to navigate in American culture, Southern California culture, where you keep your shoes on all the time and you eat lunch out of a brown sack, and you're speaking English, versus when he was home with his family, where he had to take his shoes on and off all the time whenever he went into the house, and their meals were different because they ate family style and all the food was in the middle of the table. And even the language, Thai language for him felt much more emotional because the people who were using it were very emotional around him. But after this ceremony takes place and Ben gets sick, so what happens is he starts throwing up, and he throws up every day, and it lasts for years. Um, Whenever that happens, he runs to the bathroom and he kind of locks himself in, and he realizes that there's sort of a freedom that comes from being away from both worlds, right? From just being alone and sort of having this opportunity to release a lot of tension that he had. So in a way, that time in the bathroom is like a third world that he identifies for himself, and it's a place where he really can be free from all of the other obligations.
Absolutely. I think that's why girls go to the bathroom so often at events in pairs. T. Kira, Bertie says, the worst part of being alive has always been my general loathing of people, but my sporadic, frantic need for them. New people, I needed even more. With new people, I could try out anything, from accents to faith to opinions.
Yeah, I think this connects to why the title of my book is Whidbey, even though more than half of it takes place in Florida, not on Whidbey Island, which is this character, Birdie Chang, who we meet first. She's on a ferry boat to Whidbey Island to kind of leave herself for a while, once her abuser has been outed through this best-selling memoir and reality TV show, and he's been released from prison. And I thought of Whidbey not as the island itself, because in my mind, she never actually arrives at this promise, but it's the promise of this experience where what happens if my tragedy, if the story that has been created for me is left behind, and I can try on all of these new identities like clothes on this island. And so it's very much about that fantasy. It's very much about, as I mentioned before, like these characters not really knowing who they are outside of the shadow of this person who has defined their life. My biggest fear when I wrote and published memoir was, am I only as interesting as the worst things that ever happened to me, or can I be an artist in any other way? And so this was kind of my way of illustrating that, like, who am I outside of the bad things? And for me, the island of Whidbey is like, that's where she's trying to arrive so desperately by bouncing off these different personalities and opinions and ideas.
Absolutely. And I will wholeheartedly say, yes, you are more than the bad things that happened to you with your gift of Would-Be. And seeing the cover made me gasp in those opening slides, because a lot of the covers I haven't seen just yet because they're not ready. So perfectly captures the essence of that story. Patmina, you say, most of us are in the middle, trying our best to live and raise our children to be good Muslims and Afghans, but also to live in the world as it is.
Yeah, so that quote really speaks to a theme which is woven through the novel, which is the yearning among the Afghan community, the people, the Afghans who immigrate to the US, to survive and succeed in America, to thrive and to really live that American dream. But they also only want to do it, speaking about this community, on their own terms. They want to do it, they want to assimilate, but not at the expense of their Afghan heritage, of their religious heritage. And so they are caught between those two worlds. I think in the case of the Sharafs, they believe that they can have the best of both worlds. And it's only once their children begin growing up, and I would say especially with Zora, that they realize that they are not compatible at certain points, and that they will have to make some kind of compromises or concessions one way or the other.
Absolutely. And then Jan, talking about Arby, she says, post-mom reality, I sometimes feel more vaporous than solid.
Yeah, I think it sort of speaks to sort of codependency and what happens when the tether is sort of snipped, uh, and we lose a sort of tangible evidence of the people that we were once really connected to. Um, yeah, if you've ever been through like a like a really bad breakup, or again just ever really lost someone that was a huge, huge part of your life, when you find yourself in that after space where you're like, I feel like there should be something else that I'm doing with my time, or there should be some other purpose, or um you sort of lose a sense of purpose. And I think that is that idea of like, I no longer feel solid. There is a confusion here on a very sort of deep identity level that is making me feel almost ghostly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine you feel a little bit like off balance. Things aren't quite what they were. So well said. And it's hard to believe. It is time to wrap up. Goes by so fast, y'all. So I'm going to end with a quote from Good People. People will always choose hope and goodness and love. So, all of us, let's continue to make this an always statement. And thank you to our wonderful speakers and every librarian who has joined us today. Next, we have 2 concurrent panels, World War II in Fiction and Listen to the Earth. Thank you so much, and make sure you read all these books.